They hammered the final nail into the attic door on October 15, 1855. The sound echoed like a verdict, a sentence not for a criminal, but for a secret so dangerous it demanded silence. For 78 years, no living soul dared to enter that sealed space above the Grimby mansion in coastal Maine, until the day Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez turned a key not meant to be turned. What they found behind those planks didn't just shock a small fishing village, it rippled through an entire nation, exposing a darkness people had chosen to ignore for decades. You need to understand something before we go further. This is not a story about ghosts or superstition. This is about human systems designed to manipulate, to control, to hide atrocities behind the mask of respectability. It's about communities choosing compliance over conscience. And the attic that sealed, forgotten space was a vault of that truth. Miguel had spent years on the Portland docks, his hands scarred and calloused from loading timber. Carmen, born to immigrants who had chased the American dream from Mexico to Texas, had inherited a resilience that refused to yield. Together, they had saved just enough during the Great Depression to purchase their first real home. And when they saw the Grimby mansion perched on its cliff overlooking Casco Bay, they saw opportunity. A home that promised safety, warmth, a future. But sometimes what we call opportunity is merely a lure, a rope dangling above a pit we cannot yet see. The house was imposing 3 stories of federal-style woodwork that seemed to drink in the sunlight, shutters black as ink, a silence heavier than any storm. The locals were polite, but something in their eyes betrayed a deeper fear. Conversations halted when the Rodriguez name was spoken. Children dared each other to linger near the iron gates, yet never stayed. Even the adults, the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the women at church offered smiles so tight they cut. And when they glanced at the attic, their eyes flickered with a recognition that went far beyond superstition. Something was wrong, and they all knew it. Miguel and Carmen tried to dismiss it. Old houses creak, winds whistle, memories linger. But there were nights when the house seemed alive. Doors closed themselves. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. And then came the scratching, deliberate, rhythmic, from directly above the library. For an hour they listened to it. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a rat. It was communication. It was warning. And yet, like everyone before them, they felt drawn to it. Tomorrow, Miguel said, I'll see what's behind the boards. He didn't know it then, but that single act of curiosity would pull them into a darkness that most of America refused to acknowledge, a darkness that would demand moral courage and exact a cost. The next morning, Miguel climbed the narrow staircase, the air thick with dust and decades of silence. Each step groaned under his weight, a protest from the past, warning him to stop. The planks were solid, nails old but immovable, and yet, with a combination of hammer, crowbar, and determination, the barrier began to yield. And when the final board fell away, the attic revealed itself not as an empty storage space, but as a crypt of human obsession and hidden corruption. The smell hit first. A mixture of decay, old paper, and something far fouler, metallic and coppery, like blood left to dry. Carmen held her hand over her mouth. Miguel's eyes scanned the room and froze. The attic was organized meticulously, deliberately, but in a pattern that spoke of ritual, of control. Shelves lined the walls, but not with books alone. Glass jars contained unidentifiable substances, some blackened, some crystallized, each labeled in handwriting that was precise, almost obsessively neat. Candles, burned down to their last stubs, stood in careful circles on the floor, their wax forming shapes that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. And then they saw the records, ledgers detailing every member of a local religious sect that had once operated in Beacon's Hollow. Names, contributions, confessions, debts, punishments. The level of control documented was staggering. Not just faith, but fear, obligation, psychological subjugation, rules written and enforced that bent human will until compliance became instinct. Miguel flipped through the pages, and the horror began to crystallize. These were not mere eccentric believers. This was a system designed to dominate, to manipulate, to hide crimes beneath a veneer of piety. On a small table in the corner lay objects that made Carmen gasp. Jewelry, letters, personal keepsakes, evidence that someone had been forced to leave everything behind. And then, in the center of the room, the most disturbing artifact. A ledger of disappearances. Names, ages, dates, circumstances all erased from local memory, hidden from law enforcement, and carefully scrubbed from the public record. The Grimbys had sealed the attic to protect more than property. They had sealed a secret that could shatter a community's illusion of morality. It wasn't just secrecy, it was complicity. The townspeople had known, generations had known, and they had chosen silence over justice. Miguel and Carmen felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down, a suffocating truth that threatened to reshape their understanding of human nature. And yet, there was more. Behind a false wall at the far end of the attic, hidden from casual discovery, lay a set of artifacts, symbols of ancient corruption and ritual that connected the sect to broader networks of influence stretching across New England. The attic was a nexus of control, of hidden agendas, of suppressed truths that had survived time, waiting for someone daring or foolish enough to uncover them. Carmen's voice trembled as she whispered, "Why would anyone do this?" Miguel didn't answer. He couldn't. Some knowledge, once glimpsed, changes you forever. They had crossed the threshold into forbidden history. And the question now was not what they had found, but what would find them in return. The attic was no longer just a room. It was a confession, a map of power and corruption hidden in plain sight. Miguel and Carmen began to understand the scope of what they had uncovered. This was not the work of a single family, or even a single town. The Grimby attic was a nexus, a hub of control that extended its influence outward through fear, through ritual, through secrets so carefully buried that even death could not erase them. Every object told a story. Candles burned in precise patterns, ashes still clinging to the floors, whispered messages encoded in wax shapes. The jars contained mixtures meant not for healing, but for domination, compounds used to frighten, to mark, to bind loyalty through fear. The ledgers, thick with handwriting, revealed transactions beyond money. Favors demanded, confessions coerced, alliances forged in terror. This was organized control, a psychological system designed to erase autonomy, to make people bend without realizing they were bending. And then there were the letters. Pages yellowed with age, edges brittle, written in trembling hand yet strangely authoritative in tone. They revealed a pattern of manipulation. Promises of salvation entwined with subtle threats, of spiritual reward entangled with societal shame. Entire families had been coerced into obedience, not through force alone, but through the careful engineering of guilt, hope, and dread. Miguel flipped a page and felt a chill crawl down his spine. One document described a child's disappearance, rationalized as divine necessity. Another detailed neighbors who had turned away, choosing peace over principle. The sect had perfected the human instinct to comply, weaponizing it to preserve its secrecy and power. Carmen realized something terrifying. The town had participated in this system, willingly or not. Generations of silence had become a shield for those in power. The attic's contents were proof not only of crimes committed, but of complicity cultivated. Every artifact, every ledger, every candle was a psychological footprint, a record of how easily communities could be reshaped by fear and ritual. And that was only the beginning. As Miguel carefully pried open a small chest, he uncovered symbols carved into bone and metal, objects whose meanings were lost to time, but whose intent was unmistakable. These were instruments of ritual, yes, but also markers of allegiance. Whoever had inhabited this space had been part of a system that reached far beyond Beacon's Hollow, linking them to a network of influence that most Americans would never suspect existed. And in that moment, Carmen turned to Miguel and said quietly, "We need to tell someone, but who would believe this?" Miguel shook his head. Belief was irrelevant. The danger lay in knowing. Some truths, once unearthed, do not stay hidden. They have a way of demanding attention, of reshaping perception, of marking those who dare to see. Halfway through our descent, if you are ready to claim the insight this knowledge brings, type the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice in the comments. Lock it in. Witness the shift. accept the responsibility of awareness. They stood in the attic, surrounded by objects that had no right to exist in a private home. Symbols carved into bone. Wax circles that mapped rituals meant to shape belief. Ledgers that turned faith into leverage. It was as if the attic itself was a nervous system, an archive of control impulses pulsing through generations. But what Miguel and Carmen didn't yet understand was that this wasn't just history. The system wasn't dead. It had simply gone deeper underground. Miguel flipped through another ledger, this one thinner, with ink darker, fresher. Names appeared that didn't match the old records. Birth years from the early 1900s. Notes written in a different hand, sharper, colder. Someone had been in this attic after the family abandoned the mansion. Someone had maintained the ritual space. Someone had continued the system long after the town pretended the sect had vanished. That meant the silence wasn't just historical. It was active. Carmen found a folder tucked behind the chimney bricks. Inside were newspaper clippings with entire paragraphs cut out. Town tragedies, missing persons, fires, accidents. But someone had removed the details that mentioned the same repeating symbol, a geometric mark that appeared in the attic circles. The sect hadn't vanished. It had embedded itself into the town's narrative, its tragedies, its collective memory. They didn't just control people. They controlled the story people told themselves about their own lives. That's the dark truth most never grasp. Power doesn't need to shout. It whispers. It rearranges the narrative until everyone believes the lie willingly. That attic stored the evidence of a town that had been rewritten. As Miguel spread the clippings on the dusty floorboards, he noticed numbers penciled in the margins, coordinates, dates, initials. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a sequence. Carmen whispered, "This looks like assignments." And it was. Tasks given to members, roles to play, cover-ups to maintain, even marriages arranged to keep loyalty contained within specific bloodlines. Beacon's Hollow had been engineered. A sudden creak shook the ceiling beams. Not from the wind, not from settling wood, from below, as if someone else had stepped into the house. Someone who knew exactly what the attic protected. Miguel and Carmen froze. For the first time since entering the room, the air shifted, not the stale cold of long neglect, but the warmth of proximity. Movement, presence. Carmen whispered, "Someone's here." Miguel extinguished his lantern's flame, plunging them into darkness. But even in that black void, they could feel it. The shift from discovering a secret to being discovered by it. The attic had been sealed for 78 years to keep the truth inside. Now, it seemed something wanted to keep the truth and them from ever leaving. The attic wasn't just a room. It was a trap. Miguel and Carmen realized that the walls weren't merely protecting secrets, they were enforcing them. Every object, every record, every ritual marking had been placed to manipulate memory, to control perception, to create a fortress of silence around truths too dangerous to speak aloud. And now, those truths were waking. Miguel's hand trembled as he picked up a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, filled with meticulous handwriting detailing the inner workings of the sect. Who had been watched, who had been silenced, who had been rewarded for obedience. And then, a note in a different hand. A warning scrawled in the margin. "Do not disturb the balance. Knowledge is a burden. Beware the watchers." The attic itself seemed to breathe those words into the room. The silence was no longer passive. It was alive, sentient, and judgmental. Carmen unearthed a set of maps folded so many times they were almost unrecognizable. Hand-drawn lines connected the Grimby mansion to outlying homes, forests, and even churchlands. Locations were marked with coded symbols, indicating meetings, rituals, and enforcement points. The network was vast, deliberate, and enduring. The sect hadn't disappeared, it had infiltrated, burrowed into the very infrastructure of the town, embedding itself into daily life, community governance, even the local church. Fear had been the glue. The realization hit them with full force. The town itself had been weaponized. Every neighbor, every friend, every authority figure had a role, whether as enforcer, accomplice, or silent observer. And the attic, sealed for generations, was the archive of that control. Miguel understood that this was not just history. It was a blueprint for manipulation, a manual of human obedience hidden in plain sight. And then came the sound. A faint tap, like the attic itself acknowledging their intrusion. It grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate footsteps pacing above the beams, circling, waiting. Carmen clutched Miguel's arm. "They're watching," she whispered. But it wasn't a person, not fully. It was the weight of the system, the architecture of secrecy, the legacy of power encoded into objects, ritual, and memory. The watchers weren't just alive, they were everywhere. It was then Miguel understood the scope. Knowledge had a cost. To know is to be targeted by the invisible currents of control. To uncover is to awaken forces that had been patient for decades. And in Beacon's Hollow, patience had always been the weapon of power. Halfway through this descent, if you are prepared to claim the awareness that changes perception, type the phrase, "I walk among shadows," twice in the comments. Commit it. Let it mark your passage into the forbidden. The attic had become a lens, a prism that refracted the town's past into a pattern of calculated terror. Miguel and Carmen began to see it clearly. The Grimby mansion was not an anomaly. It was the epicenter of a psychological ecosystem that had survived decades through discipline, ritual, and fear. Every ledger, every map, every artifact was a node in a network designed to dominate minds and bend wills. Miguel found himself drawn to a series of journals that detailed the initiation of new members. The entries were clinical, almost surgical in their precision. The confessions extracted, the tests of loyalty administered, the punishments designed to imprint obedience. Rituals weren't just spiritual exercises, they were behavioral conditioning. Fear, hope, guilt, and shame were orchestrated to reinforce hierarchy, cement control, and ensure silence. Reading them, Miguel felt a creeping understanding. This was behavioral engineering cloaked as religion, executed with a meticulous cruelty that blurred morality. Carmen uncovered a collection of letters exchanged with outsiders. The Grimby sect was not isolated. It had tentacles reaching into neighboring towns, networks of influence woven so carefully that entire communities had become complicit. There were coded messages, references to discipline and protection, and directives to conceal transgressions in exchange for social standing. What struck her most was the system's adaptability. It had evolved over decades, adjusting tactics, rewriting narratives, erasing traces. The community wasn't just silent, it had been trained to be silent. And then came the artifacts that chilled them to the bone. Ceremonial objects bearing symbols older than the mansion itself, items that suggested a connection to ancient rites and occult knowledge. Their function was unmistakable. They weren't for prayer, they were for control, for imposing an invisible hand upon the psyche, for teaching obedience through awe and terror. The sect had fused superstition, authority, and psychological mastery into a weaponized form of governance. As Miguel and Carmen pieced the pieces together, the attic seemed to react. A draft rose. Shadows shifted unnaturally. The subtle scratching returned, now accompanied by low groans that resonated in the floorboards. It wasn't just the house warning them, they were entering the domain of power itself. Knowledge had a weight. Awareness had a cost. And the cost was now pressing down upon them, demanding acknowledgement, demanding vigilance. The horror was not in superstition or ghosts. It was in human systems, meticulously designed, perpetuated over generations, and capable of bending entire communities to their will. The attic was proof that corruption could hide in plain sight, that fear could govern thought as efficiently as any law, that the unseen hands shaping society were not always benevolent. By now, the attic was no longer just a room of discovery, it had become a crucible. Miguel and Carmen could feel it pressing against them, the accumulated weight of decades of secrecy and control. Every object, every ledger, every artifact was a record of obedience enforced, of lives reshaped through fear. But the true horror was beginning to reveal itself. The influence of the Grimby sect hadn't died with the last generation. It lingered, active, patient, watching, waiting. That evening, as the wind howled against the cliffs, Miguel descended the attic stairs, feeling eyes on him that weren't visible. Carmen followed, her hands clutching a small journal she had taken from a hidden compartment. Outside, the town seemed quiet, almost lethally so. But Miguel knew better. Silence was part of the system. It was compliance encoded into the streets, the shops, even the churches. They weren't safe because the town had abandoned them. They were being measured, evaluated, observed. Inside, the attic had revealed a final, undeniable truth. Hidden behind a false wall was a collection of personal items. Clothing, trinkets, letters, all belonging to children who had vanished without record. The Grimby sect's psychological dominance had escalated into physical control, disappearance, and terror. And it hadn't stopped with them. The journals contained coded instructions that hinted at descendants, protégés, and others sworn to maintain the secrecy. The attic had been a vault, a repository not just of history but of ongoing influence. Carmen's voice trembled as she read one of the entries aloud. The balance must be preserved. Trust no one outside the circle. Exposure risks the entire order. Miguel realized the magnitude. The house, the town, even the very culture they had entered, had been engineered to perpetuate obedience and fear. This wasn't just a secret, it was a living system. And now, by entering the attic, they had been drawn into it. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift as if alive. The scratching had returned, slow and deliberate, circling, pacing. It was no longer random, it had a rhythm, a warning. Miguel understood. Knowledge had made them targets. Awareness always comes with a price, and in Beacon's Hollow, the cost of seeing too much was high. And yet, understanding was also power. They now had the opportunity to break the system, to expose the patterns, to shine light on what generations had been trained to ignore. But to do so, they would have to step fully into the darkness they had uncovered. Fear was no longer an obstacle, it was part of the test. The attic had taught them its lesson. The guardians of hidden knowledge always demand a reckoning, and no one enters their domain unchanged. The attic had claimed its mark. Miguel and Carmen could feel it not as physical pain, but as a shift in perception, a sharpening of awareness that was both exhilarating and terrifying. They had crossed a threshold, a boundary between ignorance and understanding. And now, standing amidst centuries of secrets, they saw the full architecture of the Grimby sect. A system of control, fear, and corruption that had infiltrated every corner of Beacon's Hollow, woven into the very fabric of the town's history. Every ledger, every jar, every ritual object had a story, but the stories converged into one undeniable truth. The town had been engineered to obey. Fear had been taught as morality. Silence had been taught as virtue, and generations had accepted it because the system made compliance instinctive. The attic wasn't just a repository, it was a mirror, reflecting the mechanisms of power that shape communities, governments, and human behavior. It was the anatomy of influence, laid bare for those daring enough to see. As they explored the attic one last time, Miguel noticed a small compartment in the far wall, previously hidden behind a false shelf. Inside were letters addressed to the Watchers, directives for maintaining control, instructions for psychological manipulation, and notes about punishment for those who questioned authority. The scope of it was staggering. A network designed to perpetuate itself, spanning decades, adaptable, patient, and invisible. The sect hadn't just survived, they had thrived through secrecy and silence. Carmen's hands shook as she held one of the letters. "This isn't just history," she whispered. "This is a blueprint." Miguel nodded. Every detail, the rituals, the disappearances, the town's complicity was a map of human behavior. The sect had weaponized belief, obedience, and fear, turning ordinary people into instruments of their system. And now, for the first time, the attic had exposed it. But revelation comes with risk. The walls, the floors, the shadows, they were reminders that power never relinquishes control willingly. The attic's lessons were clear. Knowledge changes perception. Awareness draws attention. And those who see the hidden patterns are forever marked. Miguel and Carmen understood that they could not walk away unscathed. Some truths are dangerous not because they threaten the body, but because they threaten the mind, the assumptions we build our lives upon. The Grimby attic was such a truth. It demanded recognition, demanded understanding, demanded transformation. And when they finally left the room, descending the narrow staircase, the attic behind them seemed to exhale, releasing 78 years of silence and preparation into the world. Now, the question remains not for them, but for you. When the hidden patterns of power are revealed, will you turn away? Or will you step fully into the knowledge that changes everything? The choice is yours. And once chosen, there is no return. If the hidden patterns of power and control fascinate you, subscribe now and hit the bell. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden" twice to claim your insight and step into forbidden knowledge. Share this video with anyone brave enough to witness what America was never meant to know.